I think I know most of you, but a few faces I don't. If you don't know me, I'm Michael Walls. I'm the director of DPU. I'm really happy that this event is happening. It's felt like a long time coming because we had a few tries at organizing it, but it's an important one. I think, as you know from the publicity material, for this session itself, DPU is part of a partnership with UCLG in preparing the papers that sit behind this presentation. Those papers were presented at the June 2023 UN High-Level Political Forum, which reviewed SDG, amongst others, SDG11, to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So it's a significant input to an important global discourse. In the first instance, those papers themselves drew on the Gold 6 report that was produced by UCLG in partnership with DPU's KNOW research program, that's Knowledge and Action for Urban Equality. And the papers also drew on contributions from UCLG themselves and their partners from civil society organizations. And the speakers tonight, will reflect on the key role and practices of local and regional governments as frontliners in facing the global challenges of urbanization and the territorial manifestations of complex crises, with the overall aim of making our cities and territories more sustainable and resilient. Now, that's important, of course, in itself, but it's also important because where the papers themselves were presented a year ago to the High-Level Political Forum, there is another High-Level Political Forum approaching in just a few weeks, from the 8th to the 17th of July. And it's also particularly important in the light of the fact that we risk the removal from the SDG global database of SDG indicator 11.3.2, which measures civil society participation in urban planning and management, which from our perspective is a really important one, and the loss of that particular indicator would be a significant setback in terms of, I think, some of the things that are important to those of us here and involved in the papers that we'll be talking about tonight. So I hope that sets a little bit of background on why this discussion is particularly important and comes at an important moment leading up to another set of discussions at the high-level panel. I'd like to welcome all of you in the room now, but also I'd like to welcome the people online. I think there are quite a few people there. There will be opportunity after the presentations for questions, for discussion, and I'll be trying to make sure that we're able to include any questions that come from those online. So if anyone, for all of those who are watching online, please do put your questions in, I think, the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to address those as well as those that arise from those in the room. So I think I finish there and hand over to the first speaker, Pablo. So Pablo is online and will be presenting online. So we good for that? Yep, great. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Just to confirm that you can hear me, because I can't see you. But I hope you do, and greetings from Barcelona. I would love to be in London with you, but it was impossible from our side. Well, I'm Pablo Fernández Marmisol from the World Organization of United Cities and Local Governments that, as said before, it is through UCLG and the Global Taskforce of Local and Regional Governments where we present every year to the high-level political forum the state of localization, where local and regional governments are reporting the progress on SDGs. First, I want to thank the Bartlett Development Planning Unit, particularly Karen and Adriana, not only for organizing this event, but for the long partnership that we have achieved through our research team, through our different political spaces with DPU, that has been a history of joining forces, identifying those spaces where we are politically committed to advocate for, and not only to advocate, but to research about, so that we can build our cases and that mayors and governors can present themselves different in the multilateral system. So thank you very much. I was asked to give a bit of the context of the progress of this report and where it lands. I want to say, first of all, because of what was said before myself, which is The report is presented, yes, to the HLPF, but it doesn't have a formal space in the political multilateral system. It is only national governments who have a dedicated space to present progress. So we need to keep pushing, and we need to keep building the case that not only national governments are either implementing but committed with the 2030 agenda. And this is where the whole discussion of localization comes from, because we are now hearing localization everywhere. The World Urban Forum will be about localization. The past HLPF was all about localization, but many times it's localization without the localization actors, without local and regional governments, without civil society, without grassroots movements. So we need to start again from the beginning, such as we did with the Right to the City and with the Commons, and trying to bring to the attention of the United Nations and the national delegates that the localization is not parachuting the global goals into local contexts. That it means the true implementation of the global agendas in the territories. And this is to achieve the global goals, not the opposite. And for us, for United Cities and Local Governments, which is a feminist-driven municipal movement, localizing is a political process, more than a technical process. It is a political process which is based in harnessing local opportunities, priorities, and political agendas. So for over 7 years, and now, as it was said, 8 now, we are presenting the report on cases, and depending on each of the SDGs, how progress is made. Last year, where these papers were presented, we were in a turning point on achieving the SDGs because of the SDG Summit in September in 2023, and as well because we are now ahead of the Summit of the Future in a milestone to renew the multilateral system. It is now or never where we can include the whole of government and the whole of society approach to the Sustainable Development Goals. And for this, from our constituency, but as well with the partners that contributed to the report, SDG11 plays a crucial and particularly glaring light on the critical role of what local and regional governments are doing in collaboration with communities, with partners, to achieve the 2030 agenda. So we are willing to, and we're willing to keep doing it, to center SDG 11, placing urban and territorial equality at the heart of all actions to achieve the SDGs. So even though we will talk about housing, about urban planning, about the specific targets of SDG 11, it is fundamental that we ensure that the trade-offs involved in achieving the whole of the SDGs are navigated through a human rights perspective. And from our side, it is only through the territorial approach that we will be able to ensure that these trade-offs involve a people-centered approach. So as we said, this report was facilitated by UCLG, but this is done on behalf of over 35 networks of local and regional governments, including C40, ICLEI, Regions 4, and all the sections of UCLG. It focuses in providing the most comprehensive and up-to-date overview of the state of localization worldwide. And worldwide means worldwide. So this presents many challenges. Of course, it has a particular emphasis on how local and regional governments are contributing the SDG 11, but as I said, it is the whole of the 2030 agenda. We do it through an analysis of almost 200 survey responses. And this survey, it's also accompanied by voluntary local reviews, voluntary subnational reviews, and an assessment of the voluntary national reviews that are presented each year. And this was done in 2023. We are presenting over 260 best practices, and this is universal, which is challenging for the data gathering and for making the link with the specific targets agreed in the United Nations. I will not go into the particularly data and what we reported, because this will be presented later. But I would like to flag where this lands, and from UCLG, where we have to put both the warnings and the targets on a way forward to keep these papers alive and to keep our alliance on this. The figures of the SDGs show that we have an urgent necessity to strengthen the whole of society approach to SDG implementation. That it is critical to promote a true transformation of our economic system based on subsidiarity. And this is not new. Talking about subsidiarity for this ecosystem might sound even old school, but it is still relevant to bring subsidiarity back to the attention of national delegates and the people writing the future of the United Nations. And from our side, we think that local and regional governments have the key and have found the key to open and to play a different role in redefining a just economic model, to finance in a different way the sustainable development goals. And this is through both commoning and caring, as it was defined in Goal 6 together with you on the pathways towards equality. So this critical condition for advancing the urban and territorial equality means that we need to start with a different regional approach, and that progress will be pronounced different in regions. And this has to be bring back to the attention. In the SDG Summit, after the HLPF, where this was presented, there was a critical warning, which is SDGs are not on track. After COVID-19, numbers and figures had a backlash. So we are worse than where we were in terms of progress before 2020. And they identify localization as one of the critical ways of achieving this, but other 6 transitions. And this is food, energy, digitalization, education, social protection, and jobs. Biodiversity, and then as well, the local approach to SDGs. This is really good news in terms of where we are, but it does not reflect the actual conversations that are happening now in the multilateral system. We are having 0 reference to housing, to slum upgrading, or to the territorial approach of the SDGs in the current discussions of the UN. So we need to think what's happening, and we need to bring back our key findings. We do need to keep the revitalization of the multilateral system. Only through multilateral approaches, not only at the United Nations, UCLG is one of the examples, we will be able to transform from the bottom up the coming international agendas. It is still necessary to keep strengthening the whole of society perspective to the implementation every year, not only when we discuss SDG11, and we need to bring this forward. We need to keep reporting. So we need to keep assessing voluntary national reviews and voluntary local reviews. Only with VLRs, we are representing almost 170,000 local governments. This means 1.4 billion inhabitants. So this is the scope of the local reporting that we are bringing forward. On this, I would like now to talk on the value that we have on the papers that will be presented later. These 5 papers included the adoption of the right-based approach, centering equality in the actions to localize the SDGs, and featuring over 105 local and regional government actions. You will hear from experts later, but the first is by advancing the right to adequate housing. As I said before, housing disappeared totally from the agenda. We are working together with Habitat International Coalition, with the Global Platform for the Right to the City, on assessing why this happened and bringing it to every intergovernmental negotiation we are on. Let us not forget how difficult it was in 1996. Now, with the new urban agenda, housing had a top place on the agenda. And 2 years ago, in our common agenda, it was the third priority to bring about leaving no one behind. It is not there, and we need to bring it back, and we need to build the case. Second, promoting feminist, accessible, and participatory urban planning. There is no space for planning in the budgeting and in the priorities that we are having in the Summit of the Future and happening next. We need to bring the feminist approach to the whole conversation. Third, by leading climate action and justice. Loss and damages plays a critical role. Housing, urban planning, and territorial cohesion are nowhere to be found in these discussions. And finally, by fostering the multi-level governance and balanced urban systems. We are talking about urban systems as if they were the place where all negotiations should be landing when implementation is done. And this is, again, as I said, nowhere to be found. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but this is where we are. This is what we need to bring forward. Where should we be going from the UCLG perspective? It is through the Pact for the Future of UCLG, people-centered, a different way of approaching planet, and finally transforming the system from the bottom up. We are coming to a crucial time in terms of Brazil's leadership in the G20, with equality put in the agenda, the transformation of the multilateral development banks, and then coming to the COP. A crucial part of the multilateral system as well will be the Future Generations Declaration that will be discussed in the coming months and adopted in September. And this is a place where we can land. And of course, joining forces, this is a call to action from UCLG to keep alive where we are and what we have been doing. Happy to listen as well from you. Thank you very much, and looking forward for the discussion.
So it's you two, Camila and Alex.
Hello everyone. Thanks Michael and Pablo for the amazing introductions. My name is Camila Cosiña, and with Alex Pediani, who's here, we're going to be presenting the first of the papers. We are both researchers at the International Institute for Environment and Development, IID, but also we are both former DPU colleagues, so it's very, very nice to be here at home with all of you, and also seeing so many faces that I think that have been so kind of fundamental in the work that we are going to be presenting today. So the paper that we produced was specifically focused on target 11.1. That means the target that focused specifically on housing and basic services. Can you lower it down a little bit? I'm kind of getting a bit of echo. Thank you. So the target 11.1 focused specifically on ensure access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. And as Pablo rightly said, this particular paper was produced in a context in which the figures that were launched by UN Habitat during the HLPF show the stagnation of SDG 11.1, show that more people are living in informal settlements, that the pandemic was an important kind of bottleneck on any kind of progress that had been achieved in the previous years, and also that there is a kind of that the issues of poverty, the kind of the way in which the future of people have been constrained but not advancing in this SDG is affecting particularly younger generations and children. So globally, 2.8 billion people are affected by some form of housing inadequacy, and 1.1 billion people live in informal settlements. So this is the context of when we look at how this target has been advanced, particularly by local governments. And why is this? Why is like this stagnation of SDG 11.1? What are the trends that are kind of sustaining these existing housing inequalities? Of course, there are many. And as both Michael and Pablo say, we kind of draw a lot on the work that we have done the previous years actually with UCLG on the goal report about access pathways to urban equality, and try to draw on some of those trends and understand how those are sustaining housing inequalities and stagnating SDG target 11.1. So I'm not going to go into too much detail to them, but just to give a sense, we know that there is process of financialization and commodification of land, basic services, and housing markets, and that has impact in terms of access and affordability. We know that there are difficulties in establishing healthy financial management and governance systems that ensure that actually resources get to the territories and to the people who most need it. We know that there are limited tools to engage with diverse process of housing provision and city making, that when housing is produced through the social production of habitat, through different forms of self-management, self-construction, the kind of tools that governments have to engage with those processes are, to say the least, limited. And we also know that there are limited regulations and incentives for the construction and development industry for the wider production of housing, not only in terms of social production. And also that this is paired with a wider crisis in the care and social protection systems that are actually affecting the advancement of the right to adequate housing. What we sustain then is that what these trends produce is that they are basically reproducing housing systems that end up excluding most people. For large parts of the population, based on their gender, race, class, they are basically excluding for any kind of formal provision of housing. There are systems that are extractive in the sense that they emphasize the exchange value over the use value of housing. There are systems that are exploitative, both with people but also with nature. And there are also systems that are enclosed, that look at housing as a sector that is closed in itself and not necessarily in relation with other development challenges, for instance, around health, education, and others that we're going to be discussing. So in this quite kind of not very optimistic scenario, what we did with this exercise and this report that we produced together with UCLG and in coordination with DPU was to look at this, what are the local strategies that are emerging for dealing with these challenges. We did this through a process that was very engaging with local governments on the ground. We had a consultation. We also had some one-to-one interviews and cases, and also through a process that we tried to socialize along the way. So we had a very interesting moment in the International Social Housing Festival, in which we organized with UCLG, with colleagues of HIG, with DPU, the Global Platform for the Right to the City, a moment of trying to have this open conversation on what does it mean to look at housing justice from below, housing and basic services from below. And also we presented at the HLPF itself, as Pablo said, there is not a formal moment of presentation of it, but we created a side event with, in that case, the government of Chile, HIG, UCLG, and NYU to have a moment of discussing what does it mean to look at the issues of housing from below. So the strategies, also recognizing the importance of the kind of human rights approach that is at the core of what the localization agenda that UCLG and the Global Taskforce are trying to push for, understanding this human rights approach at the center. What we tried to look at was to what extent the different initiatives, tactics, programs, strategies that local and regional governments are mobilizing actually have a play role in the full spectrum of the recognition, protection, and fulfillment of housing rights. Because many times when we talk about housing, we kind of find ourselves only looking at this part, at the fulfillment of housing, like who is actually building final units. But we understand that the role of local governments in collaboration with civil society and other organizations is actually in the full spectrum of the recognition, protection, and fulfillment of housing rights. So very quickly, what I'm going to do is to share with you what are the kind of strategies and kind of experiences and instruments that different governments, local and regional governments, are using for each of these three. And then I'm going to pass to Alex, who is going to give us some final thoughts on this kind of wider question of what does this tell us about the challenges for the multilateral system and the housing issues. So what kind of local strategies are mobilized for the respect and recognition of housing rights? We, for instance, have strategies that relate with the democratization of data collection. And data collection is part of the recognition of housing rights. Other initiatives that are more focused on the monitoring of housing conditions and organizing the demand. That is a key step in the delivery of housing that many times is like overlooked by when we look at the full process of what does it mean the access to the right to adequate housing. And also, sometimes local and regional governments that are having a very strong position in monitoring housing rights violations. In this case, many times hand by hand with social movements and organizations and advocates that are kind of putting issues of evictions and right violations at the forefront of the discussion. These are just some experiences that we highlight in the report and some images and to have an idea of what do they mean. This picture actually was taken by Alex, who is in this room, like experiences, for instance, from using forms of media and video to collect data, and then efforts from local governments to recognize some of the data for the decision making. Or in this case, a project also led by the DPU around mapping risk, for instance, and how that kind of information and data that is maybe sometimes at the margins of the official kind of planning system is critical for the advancement of the recognition of the right to adequate housing. A second set of strategies have to do with more the protection of housing rights. This has to do sometimes with responding to eviction and addressing exclusions and discriminations, but also with a series of competencies that are very, very central for local governments. We know that, for instance, in Latin America, many of the local governments don't have the competencies or the mandate to actually build houses, but they do have a very, very strong mandate in terms of having a say in land regulation, in planning, in master planning, and establishing and enforcing regulations that actually contain forces of the market to actually ensure the right to adequate housing is an important element in protecting the right to adequate housing of most people. Also, local and regional governments have initiatives that promote more inclusive and responsive forms of land tenure. We know that many times experiences that are a bit more innovative on arrangements of collective land tenure, community land trust, etc., many times have been only possible because there have been local governments that have been facilitating, supporting, or opening some doors for those to happen, when at the national level sometimes it's more difficult to have those openings. Again, the report has many experiences from all over the world, and just to show you a couple of examples, some of them are more linked to this traditional kind of planning instruments that local governments have, and like this is just a case from Chile in a kind of quite progressive regulatory plan to promote more inclusive housing in certain areas of a comuna, or as I was saying, the cases of community land trust or other forms of land tenure that have been possible due to the support of local governments. And finally, and with this I'm just going to close, is local and regional governments implementing strategies that actually advance the fulfillment of housing rights. And then here as well, we have sometimes local and regional governments enabling the direct provision of housing, either through public rent or through private ownership. And we have, of course, a more like a stronger case of this mainly with European local governments, but also in some interesting experiences in countries in which they have managed to kind of implement other alternative models that allow local governments to actually have a say in directly enabling housing units, but also, very importantly, in enabling different forms of community-led and cooperative housing and basic service, including informal settlement upgrading. And for us, it was very important to include the issue of informal settlement upgrading as one of the strategies for fulfilling the right to adequate housing that many times is ignored in the housing debate. Again, here, many experiences that are collected in the report. And just to put an example here in the case of experience that have been advanced in Thailand by the enabling of community-led housing and collective ownership, and that has been able to reach scale when there has been a local government that is actually supporting the network of communities and organizations that are behind these kind of initiatives. So with that, I'm going to pass to Alex, who is going to take us a little bit to the kind of what's next with this approach of housing from below.
Yeah, thanks, Camila. And then I think already there's a last bit there missing in the slide. Pablo was already alluding to one of the areas that that for sure the next steps is already pointing us to do. There are a lot of work already ongoing in this collaboration between HIC, UCLG, and the global platform around the pressures to the summit of the future. In terms of there, it's fundamental for us to continue pushing the housing agenda, and that combined with the localization agenda. The fact that in the first draft there is no mention of local government, the first draft for the Summit for the Future, what's the Pact of the Future, doesn't have housing mentioned there. It's a it's a really shameful and a huge shortfall, and that this type of ongoing activities is fundamental. And I know HIC and UCLG, the global platform, have been very active in the civil society space through which they can be promoting this agenda and trying to raise the visibility of that. The second area, of course, is around the COP process and the climate negotiations. My colleague Nora Nisi from IID attended the last COP, COP28, and kept her kind of ears open to where is housing and in the current conversation. And there's a blog that she just wrote. It's part of the David Satterthwaite blog series on urban transformations that explains really well this enthusiasm of the next COP as being possibly the urban COP, the most urban COP, but again, where the urban is very much seen as a space of landing between maybe activating the role of, again, as parachuting the national into the local, and also to activate private sector interest, and rarely talks about the role of local actors, as we are talking here, of civil society groups, local governments, and housing is not at all in those spaces. So being an urban COP needs to be also a housing one. And if it is to be a housing, then what type of housing? There's a whole mobilization around the decarbonization efforts, ministerial efforts led by the French government, drawing on the building breakthrough agenda, which is one that is pushing the decarbonization of the building and construction industry. There was a massive meeting in Paris of the Global Alliance of Building and Construction, the Global ABC. Many of us attended to that space to understand what's going on, and it was shocking to see, yes, housing is popping up in that discussion around the decarbonization of the building construction industry, but it's incredible the old myths that we thought we had overcome, the myths around titling, the myths that informal settlements are places to make profits, are returning with a huge legitimacy in ways that's really scary. Right? Under the name of decarbonization, under the name of transitions, and the discussion around housing being very much in the building materials, as we've been discussed, around a technological issue, and prototypes everywhere of houses being made by new technologies with a strong corporate identity attached to it, that's trying to sell the kind of knowledge, kind of property rights around that. So this is a game that is the way within which housing is emerging, in that is extremely problematic, and we need to be able to engage in those spaces, and I'll try to influence some of those conversations. But it feels like we need to go back to many things that we thought we had overcome, and we need to kind of reaffirm some of these discussions. Finally, around the G20 and the G7 negotiations, we have seen a strong emphasis around the weakening of civic spaces, the way within which democracies, the rise of right-wing politics, and way within which we have losing the conditions to sustain democratic governance have been at threats. And national governments realizing that, prioritizing that in those negotiations. Now, the mobilizations around housing, as we know, has been fundamental to promote those democratic conditions that safeguards the democratic systems. We know how housing mobilizations have been fundamental to create those democratic structures. We know how community-led housing, for example, has been means through which we have created structures of mobilization and democratization that safeguards, that promotes the deepening of democratic processes. And we are not talking at all about the way within which housing can be inserted into this discussion around safeguarding civic spaces. So we need to do more efforts around that. I know Habitat for Humanity, for example, has been trying to be active in those spaces. And one of the key questions that have been brought up often in conversations in the sideways is how much of the ODA, overseas development assistance, is actually going to housing that improves the lives of people living in informal settlements. Can we put a figure into how much of ODA is actually going that way? And can we then start pushing these targets to go up and up? You know, there are projections that may be less than half, like 0.4%, that one might actually argue might be going to housing in informal settlements. Can we actually get a figure to push? And finally, I talked about Summit of the Future, the G20, the COP, but there is another very important space, which is actually the municipalist movement. The battle is not over. Pablo made a fantastic statement here around the commitments of UCLG towards the right to adequate housing, working of civil society groups, but we know that in many contexts, local governments are also the ones promoting evictions. They are the ones that are constraining the possibilities to safeguard the right to adequate housing. And working together with UCLG, we feel that this is the kind of spaces that we can also influence the multilateral system, which is actually at the moment most open and has been most welcoming for us to engage with, which is the localized municipalist movement, which is in itself a different type of multilateral system, but a very important space for us to continue engaging and to continue influencing. So I think we stop here. Great, thank you.
So Daniel, I think you're next.
Okay. We'll come up eventually. Good. Right. Tough act to follow. Oh, something's wrong with the format.
Oh, maybe.
Something behind. Weird. I don't know what happened there.
You're asking us to people, it's okay.
That will work. Anyway, right. So, hi everyone. My name is Daniel Oviedo. I'm an associate professor here in the DPU. I'm the resident transport expert because I essentially don't know about anything else. So, and my job was very tough. So I have to say this is probably one of the hardest things that I have written in my career. But it was an effort to sort of bring a reflection about integrated and participatory urban planning from a local perspective, and how could local governments sort of influence a transformation through feminism, accessibility, and proximity principles. So what does the paper do? And here's a big disclaimer, which is behind every man writing about feminism, there are at least 10 women. And 3 of those are present here, so thanks specifically to Karen, to Julia, and to Maria Jose, who have provided huge inputs for this paper. Right, so the paper is number 2, and it deals with what I was checking just now. Is one of the worst in terms of monitoring targets of the SDGs, because we don't have data. The majority of the targets for Goal 11, including those about access to public space and public transport, do not have data in the majority of the areas where we are collecting evidence to try to monitor the SDGs. So it's a target, it's a difficult target to follow. So the paper deals with 3 of the targets of Goal 11. 11.2, which is enabling inclusive access to public transport and to different forms of sustainable mobility for all. Goal 11.3, which is access to public spaces with an emphasis on disability, racial aspirations, and minorities. And goal point 11.7, which is the one about integrated, sustainable, and participatory planning of cities and communities. And then it is connected with many of the SDGs, such as 1, 3, 5, 8, 9, and 10. The paper itself is concerned, as I said, with integrated planning and participatory approaches. And it focuses on 2 concepts, accessibility and proximity. It redefines mobility, building on Karen's work, thinking about it as the right to move freely and openly in public space without censure, without social control. And it builds on feminist approaches to urban planning as the foundation. So, I'm going to start with the trends and some of the things that we're seeing. I mean, we have 56% of the global population living in cities. They occupy, is surprising, only 0.5% of the global land, and the global land mass is still growing rapidly. And urban land consumption has exceeded the rate of population growth. So 1.2 square kilometers of new urban areas expected in 2030. There are different trends. So while industrialized countries are growing at a more moderate pace, in the urban global south, urban land has grown by 350%, while the population has doubled. And the fastest urban expansion we see it in East and Southeast Asia, which is around 6.9%, and Sub-Saharan Africa 5.1%. So it's quite considerable, the amount of land. And with that increase in the consumption of land, what we're seeing is very little access and huge inequalities in access and rights to land. So we see 1 in 4 urban residents who live in informal settlements, 70% of the world's population who lacks formal land registration, and very impressive gender disparities in land ownership. So we found from the data available that less than 15% of landholders are women when we look at it globally. And then in terms of conflict, displacement, and climate change, and this is sort of rethinking about mobility to also include human mobility in both migration and forced displacement. And over half of the forcibly displaced population globally now living in urban areas, and conflicts and climate emergencies have increased the number of displaced population to nearly 90 million people by 2023. And then looking specifically at what happens within urban areas in terms of access, we can find different factors of the current inequalities. So we see now that 16% of the urban population are persons with disabilities, and 80% of them are located in low-income countries. And by 2050, older individuals, we need to think about inclusive cities for the elderly. We're talking about 21% of the total population. And then when we look at issues of affordability, because target 11.2 is thinking specifically about public transport, there is the issue of the gender distribution of labor within households and the specific needs for mobility of women who rely on walking or non-motorized transport for trips under 8 kilometers, which is nearly almost an hour and a half walking. Then public transport costs, which are unaffordable for the majority of the low-income population. And we can see in cities like Cape Town, Buenos Aires, and Mumbai that the poorest households are spending more than 20% of their income on using transport. That's only for commuting. So any other activity gets completely excluded from motorized transport. And in some of the extreme cases, we can see that public transport can consume up to 38% of the household income. And then if we focus more on gender factors, we see the dependency of women on public transport and the need, for example, of having windows so women can complete different purposes of the trips without having to increase the cost. In Latin America, for example, women represent over 50% of public transport users. One example is Buenos Aires, which has 60% of the ridership of public transport are women. And then, of course, they are not designated, they are not designed thinking of women's, right? What we are thinking about is efficiency. We're thinking about moving as many passengers as we can, as quickly as possible, and that means we are all crowded. And at some point, at bus systems in Latin America, we're very proud of being able to fit 10 people in a square meter, which from a gender perspective, of course, looks something completely different. So it's important to think about how do we approach transport design from an intersectional perspective, and to understand the cultural norms that might limit, for example, women's access to private vehicles, even in cases where the private vehicle is available. And also the care roles and the care networks who depend from different forms of motorized and non-motorized transport for move around. And of course, after my example of the square meter where we fit 10 people, then we need to think about gender violence in public transport, which has increased disproportionately, and it's ironic because the most progress we make in terms of high capacity public transport, what we're doing is, as I said, fitting as many people as possible in a very crowded space, which is not designed and considered as public space. And of course, that means also lacking facilities like toilets, particularly, which affect women, persons with disabilities, and the gender diverse identities. And then, because I'm dealing with 3 targets, I have 3 types of trends. So Karen asked me to do 5 slides, I did 15. So access to political participation and planning. The trends are more optimistic in this sense. So we have sort of the traditional modes of citizen participation, but we have also been able to identify two different forms of consultations, strategies such as participatory budgeting, referendums, and many forms of civic protest and local demonstrations, as well as, for example, the roles of juntas de acción comunal and other forms of local participatory spaces. We're also seeing persistent biases in urban, in particular, transport planning. Transport is one of the most traditional sectors that we have in planning. And we tend to plan for the peak hour of the morning, which is only commuting, and is essentially designed for cisgender men who are able-bodied. So all those different biases continuing fitting along, and we have a problem which is related with data, and is that we tend to plan for the average, and that average invisibilizes sort of the most diverse parts of society who have very specific needs. And then we have, of course, as a consequence, the impact on marginalized groups, including the underrepresentation, particularly of women and girls who lack presence in planning roles, but also barriers to participation for racialized persons with disability, and other minorities. So with that landscape in mind, what we identified in the paper were three strategies for that local and regional governments have been engaging with in order to transform planning, specifically through feminist approaches. So we have seen the incorporation of feminist planning principles in the form of planning trainings, capacity building, tools and initiatives grounded in feminist principles, accessibility and universal design. And again, this was a challenging paper to write, in the sense that we were pulling in different directions, right? There was, of course, a concern about how to incorporate feminist approaches, but then the definitions of accessibility were very much oriented towards universal design and groups of persons with disability. So there was quite a wealth of information to reconcile in this context, and something that is important is that we have made significant progress in incorporating universal accessibility standards for design, as well as engaging with older people and persons with disability for informed practices. And that has to do not only with the design, but also through the appropriation of public spaces and the way in which communities have come together to transform locally at a very restricted spatial scale, but that is very much scalable up. And that's something that different local governments have integrated into their planning processes. There are issues of recognition and sort of trying to think differently about how we recognize, for example, the care burden and the consequences for urban mobility practices, and the design of, for example, targeted fare systems that can enable hopping fares, right? And that's something that has been implemented from London to Mexico City, and there are some very interesting examples. Then there is the need for integral local policy and the promotion of rights for minorities. But something that is very important that has come across throughout the whole paper is that need for reconciling the private and the public spheres of life, and sort of thinking differently about that productive sphere which has driven most of the decisions, specifically about infrastructure investment that we have on mobility and transport. So the need for eliminating inequalities in access and use of public spaces, the revalorization of caring practices and relations, and I have a very good example for this in a moment, and the support of everyday activities through urban design and infrastructure. Now, in terms of reducing inequalities in access to and use of land, public space, and public services, there are some things that have started emerging. And again, one positive strategy is the recognition of walking as a mode of transport. And it's something that hasn't happened recently. I mean, has happened recently, but that didn't happen in the last 20 or 30 years of planning, in which the priority, and it's actually the way in which the SDG 11.2 is written, is about public transport. And they were sort of that ignoring of the need for permeability of urban structures for people to be able to access that public transport and to connect those infrastructures as a leverage to try to promote public spaces. So that's changing now, and there is a tendency towards redistributing facilities and the use of, especially after COVID, digital technologies for enabling access when mobility, physical mobility, is not necessary. I'm going to take 3 more minutes if I'm allowed. Then there is the issue of integrating the productive and the reproductive skills, the reproductive spheres. And one of the things that has happened recently is the use of public transport infrastructure to transport-oriented development models, to try and to bring closer facilities for healthcare, for education, and for public spaces for recreation and social interactions around public transport stations. We have all heard about the 15-minute city, and there are different approaches to that. Of course, we cannot prescribe a specific number of minutes that facilities must be accessible from, but we do need to continue thinking about proximity. So that's why I'm not saying specifically 15 minutes here, and there are different examples that can show that proximity models are possible depending on the context, depending on weather, depending on many other context-specific considerations. There is the need to access, ensuring access and mobility, and we have made significant progress in terms of thinking proximity and public transport infrastructure, targeting fair mechanisms to address specific needs, and promoting multimodal transport, as well as empowering marginalized groups. So one key example in terms of how we're redistributing the investments in public transport infrastructure are cable cars. In cable cars, when they are well made, they can enable access to areas that have been historically ignored in the processes of urban planning and connectivity. And then finally, in terms of changing the way in which we have planning, and I'm sorry for the very small font, some of the things that have come across, specifically with the conversations with the disability groups, is the need for transparency and accessibility in data, which means not only open data, but also data that is accessible for blind people, for persons with neurodiversity, to be able to find different ways in which evidence can be transparent, verifiable, and accessible by different groups. Then there is the issue of monitoring and improvement, and in the haste for investment and development, we usually forget to raise baselines for monitoring of impact, particularly with a focus on women, on children, and on elderly and persons with disabilities, which also means building monitoring evaluation into intervention budgets and mainstreaming subjective and perception monitoring instruments to be able to see how people feel, which is something as important as what they do. Then there is the strategies for community participation, which include strategies such as participatory budgeting and different ways in which we are addressing barriers and inequalities faced by structural discriminated groups. The co-creation of multi-sector interventions, one key example is the integration between education, health, and mobility, for example, in the context of safe routes to school. And then, of course, there is the issues of data collection and analysis. So the paper includes very different experiences from these three strands of strategies, which have from the specific design and improvements for safety of women and girls, which is something that we found in Lisbon, to multi-state local governance in the context of Dominican Republic and so on. So there is the whole integration of public and transport and public systems. Now, I wanted to give a very quick example, which features prominently in the paper, which is the care system of Bogota. And that integrated essentially everything that I mentioned so far. Is a mobility system with pedestrian and social interactions, but is integrated with public space, with that focus on care and social services and an integrated network of utilities and services. So essentially what's happening in Bogota at the moment, and that's part of the land use plan that is currently working, is increasing the coverage with territorial equity, improving safe and ethical experience of public spaces by understanding the environmental conditions, mitigating impact, and creating an institutional articulation for urban space planning. That has the form of three different strategies which are very specific for the territory, which is what they call complete streets, and it's an emphasis on cycling and walking for connecting the territory. The green corridors, which are more inclined towards nature-based solutions and integrating the built and the natural spaces, and the vital neighborhoods, which are connected with the infrastructures of care. And the provision at the local scale within 10 to 15 minutes walking, or the most by cycling, of different forms of social services, trying to ensure equality of opportunity and social integrations, and that have different facilities that are integrated in this context, with a focus on, this is the full extent of Bogotá, having at least one care block in each of the administrative zones for planning. So just to close, the key messages looking towards 2024 and post-2030. The first is we must reimagine urban planning for inclusivity and sustainability, and here understanding and integrating these equitable practices that have been emerging and that guarantee equal rights and opportunities is something that must become a priority. Then there is the issue of addressing marginalization and promote equity, and is recognizing the invisibilizations that we do when we collect data and plan for the average, and to try to think differently about the lived experience of particular social identities and challenge the traditional development models. Then there is the issue of promoting safety, well-being, and social services, and is thinking further and coming from the practice of transport. We usually think about safety in terms of traffic collisions, and that's pretty much it. So thinking about harassment, thinking about exposure to crime, and thinking about different, what they call co-benefits in the traditional practice, but actually are integral parts of well-being across the life cycle, which is very important. And then fostering resilient and healthy communities by implementing policies to build resilient urban environments. And finally, championing participation and transparent governance. And in that sense, especially in a context in which data is becoming more and more widespread available, and where we have risks such as AI making up evidence, it's very important to have more participatory, accountable, and transparent governance systems that ensure open, accessible, and inclusive access to evidence for planning. And that's it. So thank you, and sorry for taking away.
Thanks to Daniel. We have two more short presentations from Adriana and Julio, and also from Karen after that, and then Lorena will be giving a response to the presentations, or a reaction brief. I do want to remind you, if you're online, please put your questions into the Q&A, and anyone in the room at the moment, if you can just remember what you do want to ask. We will have a little bit of time, but we will be needing to be quite efficient with our use of time. So if you have your questions ready, it's going to be easier when we get to that point. Also remember who you want to direct them at. Just be aware also we have representatives from other organizations, Habitat International Coalition, the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, Islam or Shack Dwellers International are all present. So I hope that that will add to the richness of the conversation, but also to the importance of making sure, as much as I can, that I'll run it as efficiently as I can. So do save your questions up, and thank you to Julia and to Adriana, who is speaking first.
I'm going to go ahead, I think.
Go for it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Great. So it's great to be back in this room online with so many familiar faces and also people I don't know yet. Adriana and I have written a script because we're not very famous for sticking to time. So I hope you don't mind that you're reading. And it's also going to be like snippets of the paper rather than a comprehensive overview. So if you want the full paper, scan the QR code now. So what we wanted to, or what we were doing in our paper was to explore the kind of trajectories of systemic change when we're thinking about this polycrisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecological overshoot. And we got inputs additional to kind of working with all the rich renaturing chapter from 22 different local authorities, as well as some of UCLG's partners for that. And what we really focused on was to think about like the interdependency between human and non-human rights, and the pathways for fostering some kind of equality in our opportunities of how we thrive and how environmental benefits and burdens are being distributed, considering obviously the intersectional identities that Daniel has just outlined. So if we're starting with the talk of the walking the talk, and what has already been kind of committed to in the global agendas and the rights-based agendas, we're obviously seeing that SDG11 and the points that we focused on are not independent, but are within a wider framework of other conventions, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also the Sendai Framework for Action. We also, as with the other papers, we know that SDG11 and the environmental parts of it are very much connected to other SDG targets, clean water and sanitation, affordable affordable and clean energy, responsible consumption and production, etc. And the 3 SDGs or targets that we focused on were, on the one hand, those that relate to the reduction of losses from disasters in terms of deaths, but also economic losses. Also the adverse environmental impact of the cities themselves, and the provision of universal access to safe, inclusive, accessible, green and public spaces, also parts which Daniel has already partly covered. So I'm trying not to kind of duplicate what has already been said. The other part, of course, is then if we're looking from like the talking to the walking and what is actually been happening, it's not only, I think, a stagnation, but it's that in many cases the pace is far too slow, so we're talking about accelerations, but we're also completely off track and we're walking in the wrong direction. So it's not everything that we want to accelerate, actually. So we have identified, I think, 4 global trends. And again, I think speaking to this audience, you know most of them, or all of them, and some have already been mentioned. So one is that UNEP says that, according to UNEP report, that cities consume 75% of global natural resources. Now, if we're thinking about reducing our material consumptions in alignment with net zero targets by 2050, that would mean that urban settlements would have to cut their consumption by at least 50%. But we're on track to tripling global material consumption by 2050. So that's obviously then a question not only of how do we use materials more efficiently, or which materials can we substitute with other materials, but then we also have obviously the highly unequal distribution. So for example, Africa has a per capita footprint roughly of 1 to 5 tons, while North America, Europe and Australia use about 20 to 50 tons. So we have a question of efficiency, of substitutions, but also the question of redistribution and what is sufficient and for whom. The second trend is something that Daniel has already covered, but perhaps with slightly different numbers, is that about our cities expanding physically faster than the human population are growing. So we have an annual land consumption rate of 1.7% that stands vis-a-vis a population growth rate of 0.6%. So regional differences, and also Daniel has outlined that, are vast. But we're thinking about like de-densification and population growth, and an urban land use increase from 1 million square kilometers to 2.5 million square kilometers by 2050. If we're then, on top of that, considering the massive infrastructural deficits, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, and those projections, then we're estimated that we need infrastructure for an additional 3.4 billion new urban dwellers by 2050, which is equivalent to 50% of the urban fabric. So that's just to put into, add some light numbers to what has already been said. So the question is then, how do local and regional governments develop integrated policies that really take seriously those questions of nature-based solutions, which so far are very, very little if we're thinking about like what is globally invested in infrastructure, and densification, as well as agglomerations. Again, the climate emergency has already been covered, and the question of loss and damage as well by Alex. We know that we're not on track on the global warming targets. So what I wanted to just flag are like the two elements or two changes that have happened since we've published the report. So on the one hand, obviously there was COP28, which was a massive milestone in committing to the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. Again, commitments versus pledges is a big gap, but there is an advancement I think that is important to recognize at this stage. And the second is we have looked at the numbers for the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and they have gained a lot of further traction over the past year. And today represent more than 1.2 billion people in almost 13,400 cities. So this is, in other words, meaning that local and regional governments are acting, and they're acting at scale, but they're acting on a rapidly reducing and further reducing window of opportunity. And then the final part is that, all these 3 trends highlight, and again, and this is coming up, the centrality of addressing urban inequalities and finding new forms of governance, and something that Karen is going to talk about shortly, to counteract also the privatization, the commodification of environmental assets, of land. And we see that very, very strongly in trends around green gentrification. So I think I'm going to hand over to Adriana to bring us a bit to the lighter parts of what is actually being done about that.
Okay, thank you so much. much, Julia. And not necessarily, but I am very conscious of the time we have, limited time we have, and I'm desperate to get also to the debate point because we have an amazing group here and also online. So I will try to be as fast as I can. What we found and what we argue in the paper is that actually addressing all these trends requires, and this is just hypothesis to start with, requires 4 significant pathways. And those are, we call them decoupling, restoring, localizing, and commoning. Again, I don't have time to give the many examples that we found about each of them. Again, for that, look at the report. But it is important to say that when we look at how is that these pathways manifest, there is very, very incipient. Each of these pathways is only very incipient. We really have to stretch ourselves not just to take a stock of what action is happening, but what action could be happening in many cases. So when we talk about decoupling, what we are talking mostly is about decoupling urban development from extractivist approaches and very much from what we call accumulation by dispossession, what we see in land and housing markets in a nutshell. Again, the expression of the engagement of local authorities with different forms of decoupling and dealing with different forms of extractivism and the impacts of extractivism is still very, very incipient. It's much rare, unfortunately, that we would expect. But when we look at how they're trying to do this, usually this appears or emerges in the form of parts of a municipal movement that are trying to engage with the creation of some form of circularity, circular cities, circular territories. And that means producing different flows and different forms of looping and closing flows of resources across urban economies and territories. A typical strategies used for that have to do with regenerating, sharing, optimizing, repairing, exchanging, or using a combination of these approaches. And I call you to think about the importance of this. It's not about building, it's not about new building and so on. It's really very much about using differently what we already have. The transformative potential, what we found of these the most radical approaches to creating circular cities, because there are many approaches that are also not radical at all or are rather greenwashing, really lies in the commitment of these approaches to be rooted in the most vulnerable territories and cities to extractivism, to different forms of extractivism. So we need to think about that as well. Where is that we are trying to create circularity? I move very quickly to the second pathway, that one of restoring, and this tries to shed light on the current and future infrastructural and service needs that need to be met, but in a different way. And what we found is that some authorities, local and regional governments, are starting to think about the question of infrastructure as a form of restoring, as something that has to be approached through the restoring of the city and the territory ecological structure. This is something that, again, Pablo made reference to when he talked about the importance of a territorial approach. And this is a very particular aspect where we are seeing that territorial approach being materialized. What restoring means is for local and regional governments to grapple with very, very difficult questions, matters and questions of corporate capture, of the common good, of path dependency, of investment biases, in the hegemonic ways in which we approach infrastructural transitions and both conceiving and negotiating them. Across the Global South, we also know that infrastructure pathways are typically underfunded and they're often massively reliant on what we see or what are seen as improvised forms of development, which is still what we also see in cities is a prevailing view that sees those pathways, those ways of incremental infrastructural development very much in tune with nature in many cases, or in nature in cities, being rendered as inadequate. So there is a very important aspect in all these pathways in terms of the need for a change of perspective. The third pathway talks about localizing. I really like how Pablo introduced that, and the need to bring the key localizing actors to the conversation, to the COP, to all the conversations and the challenges that we are talking about. When we talk about localizing, of course, we are talking about the importance of going and working across mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage mechanism. And there is a real issue here because we find a very high degree of boxing these agendas precisely on mitigation and adaptation with the appearance now in the picture of loss and damage. Again, we need to remember that these are mechanisms that were proposed back in 1992, and only became a commitment at the last COP, but still with very important considerations with regards to how they will be handled. We couldn't find any local policy, any local action really working in the localization of loss and damage mechanisms, and that is quite telling. But we found some interesting national policies that have very important localizing elements, and this is why we talk about the state of Kiribati that has been taking a very important campaign that they call, let me just, Migrate with Dignity campaign. Migrate with Dignity campaign is creating a number of regional commitments to think about how migration and relocation might happen when rehabilitation in situ in the light of the climate emergency becomes completely unviable. The last one, commoning. Lots to discuss here, and I'm looking at Lorena to leave almost commoning there for her to expand. Commoning is, put simply, and because I'm running out of time, commoning is very much about bringing back, reclaiming the social and ecological functions of cities and territories, and realizing that these are not two different exercises, they are two intertwined exercises. I could talk about some approaches, but again, there are many around that, and many of those, this is interesting, much more overtly addressing the question of green gentrification, both in this case in the United States, but also across the global south. So this question of a plethora of new planning mechanisms to address green gentrification emerging, to correct or address also the redirection of funds to where they should be, and to this basically, just to reclaim the social and ecological functions of cities. So, just to finish, walking the talk in the right direction. Julia said that before. Yeah, we are moving fast, but not necessarily in the right direction, and sometimes not fast enough. What is very, very clear is that what we have discussed or what is underpinning all these actions is a cry for systemic change. But we do have to remember that, as Chico Mendes used to say, or said once, environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening. And we have a lot of gardening or a lot of greenwashing, and this is an issue in the pocket or from the perspective that we're looking at cities and the transformation that is required. Is still that articulation of the social and the ecological aspects and objectives is critical. What we argue is that to talk the walk into the right direction and at the right pace means to walk that cry for systemic change, and at least remembering 4 things. The first one is to tell the truth, and we live surrounded by policy empty promises, and I think that it's interesting to look, for instance, at the way in which many cities like Bogota, again, but many others, have used the declaration of climate emergency precisely as a way to tell the truth, as a way to say the clock is ticking, we have to change the mode in which we are working. Second, again, we talk about the importance of realizing that we are walking too slow and in many instances in the wrong direction and need to act now, but for many things and many targets that are not going to be realized now. And here as well we need to tell the truth. Many of the things that we are aiming to do are of a medium to long term, and this is quite difficult for local authorities to do. Third one, we need to go beyond politics and as usual, And this requires the adoption and the thinking of truly democratic mechanisms in the co-creation of these pathways. We have the elements. When you look at cities and you find mesas de trabajo, citizens' assemblies, and so on and on and on. But they are not fully utilized for the type of democratic agreements and pacts that we require. Doing things different, and here I almost finish, requires a very different way of approaching all these urban life systems that we have been talking about, whether we are talking about housing, land, food, water, energy, sanitation, and so on. And the critical question here is to remember all the time that we are not talking only about the question of access to these critical lifelines, but we are talking about the control of these urban lifelines for and by ordinary citizens. And this is one of the most critical questions where we need to push a lot. Here I just try to put an example, for instance, in the example, the message of, in this case, of housing rebellion, but you will find this in many other civil society movements, the message of refurbish, don't evict, or demolish, which is calling, actually, is creating a very clear intersection between the climate crisis and the housing crisis, and saying we are going again completely in the wrong direction by knocking down the existing housing stock, which doesn't make sense environmentally, socially, or in economic terms. I'm going to finalize by just again paraphrasing someone else, James Baldwin, because he said once something that again we could reshape a bit, but we need to remember that the place in which we can exist, and thus are not exactly his words, will not exist until we make it. And this is really very much in the making, and this is why the importance of spaces like this to debate, to put our heads together and our hands together is extraordinarily critical. I look forward to the debate, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. I'm Karen Levy, a professor here at the Development Planning Unit, and the development of paper 5 takes us to a different scale from the previous papers. In fact, at this scale, we're talking directly to national governments, okay, who, as Pablo said, actually have the political space in the seats at the table around reporting at the SDG summits, and who sometimes don't always look towards the local authority space in doing that. Before I present exactly that focus, I want to start by thanking and acknowledging the support of Edgardo Bilski, who the former director of research at UCLG, as well as those LRGs, Global Taskforce members and partners who also inputted into this paper and into this thinking. So the paper 5 focused specifically on support positive economic, social and environmental links between urban, peri-urban and rural areas by strengthening national and regional development. And the indicator is a very specific indicator. It's the number of countries that have national urban policies, or NUPs as I'm going to call them, national urban policies or regional development plans that respond to the changing population dynamics, that ensure balanced territorial development, and that increase the local fiscal space, which obviously is incredibly important. Okay. And the way that I would like to kind of revisualize this, and the way that I tackled this with my colleagues, was to actually talk about this as advancing multi-level governance, which actually resulted in reinforcing many different SDGs. So in other words, at the heart of this focus of 11A is looking at balanced and equal urban and territorial systems, as Pablo emphasized right at the beginning, decentralized multi-level governance, and always present, even at this national and regional level, the right to democratic, inclusive, and active engagement. And what you can see here are that these issues touch not just SDG 11A, but a number, as in my colleagues' papers, a number of other SDGs, and hence really important to recognize that as contributing to the advancement of a series of different SDGs. Now, the key trends. First of all, and I won't spend too much time here because my colleagues have really done an excellent job in showing these growing inequalities that we're dealing with in a number of different areas. Economic, social, environment inequalities. But this particular SDG 11A is looking at those inequalities between regions, urban areas, peri-urban, and rural areas. And what we can see is those same kinds of growing and particularly inequalities, particularly between large cities and metropolises, and inequalities in secondary cities and rural hinterlands. And these spatial inequalities, socioeconomic, environmental inequalities are growing. And of course, we shouldn't forget that the pandemic and armed conflict, which sadly we live with in many different ways today, intensify these inequalities. Looking at the actual measurement that the SDGs put in place, the target that they put in place, what we see that the figures telling us, the data that we do have, is a continued top-down national policies with a very limited focus on inequalities in national, urban and regional planning. And if we have a look at particular studies which show that 91 out of 162 countries actually have coherent, what is called coherent NUPs, or national urban policies, of those, only around half responded to the changing population dynamics, which means that they didn't get in touch with the people in the different contexts. Only around half addressed balanced territorial development, so we're not getting close to the spatialized, localized practices, and even less, only about a quarter, focused on increasing local fiscal space for local authorities. Okay? So these are, I think, very telling trends in relation to this particular SDG. And indeed, what we see here is a limited view of who citizens are in their place, in their geography, and certainly a very limited view of the spirit of subsidiarity in any shape or form. We also see, as many of my colleagues have indicated, limited participation of local and regional governments and citizens in the multi-level governance process. If you look at the way in which these multi-level governance processes have been conducted around the development, the formulation, the implementation of national urban policies, you find a very low engagement with subnational governments, okay, between national and subnational government levels, and you find even a lower participation of citizen groups in that process. And we know, as my colleagues have said very clearly, that the political representation also exhibits very strong patterns based on social identities, intersectional social identities. And so this becomes a really important issue to take into account. And what I think is, and some of us have already alluded to this, which is extremely worrying, is that in a contemporary context, 75% of our global population live in 73 countries where political rights and civil liberties are declining. So we are talking about focusing centrally on the involvement and the right of citizens to participate, and yet we're living in this kind of reality. So we may well ask, how can national urban policies empower local and regional authorities to address intra and inter-urban inequalities in a democratic manner? How do we do this? Again, like my colleagues, I will allude to broad pathways, which I think I've already started to talk about. I think we need to continue the pressure for a coherently decentralized multi-level governance in which the principle of subsidiarity is at the center. Subsidiarity, the lowest effective level of decision making for issues. So the lowest effective level of decision making for issues varies depending on the issue. Okay? And we need to be cognizant of that and to build that into the way that this is done. And we're talking about, in relation to this, looking at 3 dimensions: the political aspects, in particular the legal basis for the devolution of power within multi-level governance structures. If there's no legal basis for that, we don't have the political commitment to this, and it's unlikely to happen. In terms of the administrative arrangements, we need a clarity on the roles and relations between different scales of government. The question of coordination, of capacities at different scales of government. And what we started to see in many cases are innovative and collective examples of innovative collective relationships and arrangements that have tried to start working with that. This is an example of an Australian example, as it happens, of so-called city deal. But there are many emerging examples where we see co-financing relationships emerging and ways of working together of different levels of government. We're also talking about developing and reinforcing a set of national, regional, and local policy and plans to create a balanced and equal interurban system of small, intermediate, and large cities and metropolises. This is at a very broad scale, and I think, for example, Danielle's paper started to press the buttons where these things become very important, of how you begin to do that. And I think really what one's also looking for are different and innovative platforms for collaboration and coordination in this situation, and examples, for example, like the Integrated Urban Development Framework in South Africa, which has its flaws, but it also has an aspiration to achieve that kind of coordination. We're also talking then about ways to promote inclusive, participatory, and accountable multi-level governance processes, and defining here the appropriate scale, this appropriate spatial scale, and democratic arrangements for participation. So when we're talking about participation, I think there are many different possibilities and ways of organizing it, as my colleagues have talked about already. Area-based approaches, participatory budgeting, these are all different scales which need to be fashioned around the particular place, the particular context in which things are being, where people are working. So putting these together, I think what one sees here are not just, as I said, pathways to SDG 11A, but actually progress towards a whole range of other SDGs that touches on a whole range of other, expanding the room for maneuver for advancing on these global goals. I want to end by talking about just a few pointers around realizing the power of localization. We've all addressed that in some way or another. I think since I'm dealing with multilateral governments, I focused particularly on the power of governing in partnership. And this is a central principle within the UCLG Pact for the Future. And I think we cannot foresee addressing the complex and different challenges that we face internationally if we don't govern in partnership. We cannot foresee addressing the diversity of situations well and effectively if we don't govern in partnership. And I think at the center of that, unsurprisingly, we're talking about supporting the rights of citizens in all their diversity to be engaged with the decisions that affect their life. And here I come back to where Michael started, the importance of retaining the monitoring indicator that monitors the participation of civil society in planning. This indicator is at risk simply because it is not being reported on. We can't allow that to happen. It's too central to the issues that are important to us. We need to keep on, and this is a long history. I think this is a very long discussion that's happened over decades on creating decentralized multi-level governance in a way that respects subsidiarity in the political, administrative, and financial terms that I discussed earlier. And here, I think what has gone largely unrecognized is the potential of national urban policies to actually support local processes that my colleagues talked about previously. There's an enormous potential there to bring local and central governments together with civil society in order to make these things and support processes that we're talking about. And there is a role for all in that, important role for all. Central government has an enormous capacity to redistribute if it so intends, okay? And so when we're talking then about maintaining and defending, and I've put it in these words because I believe in the light of what my colleagues have said, it's obvious, we need to keep defending and extending the political commitment to leave no one behind. We cannot assume that this is automatic, okay? I think one of you talked about the return of myths. We know there's a return of many, many myths here. We cannot assume. We need to keep strengthening the processes, the content of multi-level policy and planning that reinforce pathways to balanced and equal urban systems and maintain the importance of this as a key issue because it can so easily be subsumed under other agendas which we know are all around us. So I'll end there. Thank you.
So thank you very much to all of the speakers. We can, I don't know if everyone in the room can manage to hang on until 6:30. We can continue until then. We will need to finish at 6:30, but it does give us 20 minutes now for some discussion. But before then, I'd like to invite Lorena to give a few comments as discussant.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, everyone, Leon in particular. It's a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to share this important conversation. I have a lot of notes. They're not very well organized, so I'm not going to go through them. I'll just focus in a few points because I really want to hear from all of you. So, of course, I think it's important to put this work a little bit of context. And I think part of the richness of this report is that we did have collaborations before, and there were collaborations before between the different actors, one, and two, this is part of a broader strategy of collaboration, of capacity building and advocacy. So among UCLG, local and regional governments, with academic partners, UCL in this case in particular, and DPU, but also with civil society organizations, and many of those already mentioned here. So I think it's important to understand that this report is not coming out of nowhere. And in fact, if you look at this particular report, it will be different from previous reports on localization that even the same UCLG did before, right? And what I'm trying to say here that, of course, because of that, and because being part of that broader strategy and collaboration, is part of a common narrative now. And so we of course agree, as part of the civil society movements, we agree with the values, we agree with the principles, and we very much agree with the pathways that they are putting forward in the different sections. And actually, I could say that we somehow helped building those through the different processes, different previous documents, different discussions, different debates, both internally, I would say, or inside that ecosystem, but also in face of the multilateral agencies, and in particular the UN system. And trying to advocate both local and regional governments and so-called civil society for a space there, for having room to say our proposals, to share our proposals, to put forward our demands, etc. So I think it's a long-standing collaboration, several years now, let's say even decades in some cases, but several years collaborating together, co-creating, and it's part of a broader strategy. So creating that capacity building and advocating in those different spaces, and Pablo at the beginning already mentioned some of those spaces. Alex also did mention some of those spaces of this connection between the global and local agenda. So that's one of the issues I want to highlight in terms of tensions or challenges we're facing. And so I think one of those is this connection between the local agendas and the global agendas. And even the terminology of localizing can be problematic in the sense of, it seems that global agendas, they're mostly decided by national governments and multilateral agencies and actors in those spaces. They're very difficult to access to and to participate in. It seems that they agree upon those agendas somehow, and those agendas are actually getting reduced and reduced over time. And I mean, in terms of the potential, transformative potential they have, if you look, over the past 50 years or so, international agendas is crazy. But in any case, we have those agreements. And then by localizing, it seems that then at the local level, civil society, local governments, all the actors are kind of seeing how they can implement those agendas. And I think that's not the idea here, that's not the spirit, and actually we're thinking not only in two directions and bidirectionally, but also, in fact, probably vice versa. I mean, we're talking from the bottom up. And if any elements are still to be found in those agendas that are really transformative and radical, mostly, there are those most probably coming from the local level and the local communities. And even many of those local policies that are progressive, as we saw in the case of Bogota and so many other cases all over the world, the progressive local policies, in fact, most of them started as civil society initiatives. Right? So I think it's important to look at these and even to look at the language and questioning that language and saying it's a reverse process. And why this is important, I'm going to end with this. I think when we talk about this collaboration between local governments and civil society broadly, we're not just talking about co-creation and co-management and in terms of public policy and initiatives, which is fundamentally important. So not just participation, but actually co-creation and co-management. And within this, the commoning approach is crucial, as Barbara here also knows, working on one of those previous papers that contributed a lot to this report. That's one of the key strategies for commoning. It's actually that civil society or community public partnership. No? So community or public community partnerships that we're trying to push forward. And those are crucial, for sure. But I think it's also crucial in terms of renewing, rescuing, we can find many other verbs, democracy. And democracy that is strictly linked with, of course, social cohesion and with the trend of polarization that we're seeing everywhere. So, and our feeling is that democracy is not going to be safe by the national level, by the national governments. Quite the opposite. I mean, there are very few exceptions globally, but Karen already mentioned this, right? 75% of the population living in 70 plus countries that are going in the opposite direction. So that's the majority, right? So if there's any hope to be found, it's actually at the local level. And this is crucial for us too. And finally, of course, the transformative potential of this. And that's the other tension between, and you already mentioned this, immediate action and need to solve immediate needs. Vis-a-vis the need for these processes to be like medium-term and long-term transformations and to be maintained. So in the report, when talking about challenges, because the report is made from the point of view of the local and regional governments, there are many challenges identified there, of course, lack of resources, lack of coordination, etc. But lack of continuity of the policies, I don't think is quite mentioned. And from a civil society point of view, that's fundamental, because even when you have the political will, when you have the innovation at the local level in policy making and all that, then you have elections, of course, we need elections, but then you have changes, and then you don't have continuity, and then you need to start all over again. And in some cases, it's even not just stagnation, but it's actually going backwards. So for that is crucial, that collaboration. So even going beyond governments and going beyond the political staff, right? And trying to find ways to collaborate and be sure that those policies and innovations can remain in place, right? So I think the report is terrific. It's really a lot of work. It's an amazing work. And I think it's very, very useful, and we should be discussing probably how to use that more. Not only at those global processes and global agendas, but also even here in universities, in capacity building, in training, in challenging silos and thinking in a different way. Because it's clear that we know the what. It's pretty clear that we all more or less know the what and can agree on the what. I think it's the how, and the report is shedding a lot of light on that, on the how. Then we need to go deeper in that and guarantee that we can maintain those innovations and transformations and go deeper into what we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I think that's a pretty good place to start for some discussion. Because, I mean, if we know what we need to do, but we need to work out how to do it, well, maybe we should be talking right now about how we might start that process or how we might take it forward. I think we haven't got questions at the moment online. Who would like to go first here?
Yeah, thank you.
If you can just introduce yourself, and then, and if, I don't know if you're directing your question or comment to a specific person or to more than one, but the more specific you can be, the more specific the answers will be.
Sure, thank you. So I'm Ella Coletta, I'm a Bartlett alumni. I worked across many sectors by now. I worked for the UN Habitat, now I work for the local government. And a question popped into my mind when Alex and Camille were speaking about carrying out negotiations in these high-level fora about bringing localization to the agenda and making sure it's not forgotten about. And as you've just summarized, Michael, in a sense, what we focus on today is here is what the current situation is, here is what we'd like to see happening moving forward. And I think what Karen and Lorena have brought towards the end, for me, critical is, and that's where my question is, well, why are those national stakeholders not engaging on these topics? And really, I'm interested, when you carry out these negotiations, what are the top reasons for why there is not that real sense of engagement? And I think what Karen and Lorena has highlighted for me was that sense of, well, the complexity of the UN system and the highly bureaucratic nature of the national policy making, and just how exactly do we try and connect the two in a really practical sense, because we know what we need to do, but what I'm really interested in is how do we target that in terms of trying to operationalize those that move towards localization. And yeah, it's just trying to think about how do we target that. And I guess what I'm interested in is not the obvious, what maybe the conclusions we jump to that are on the surface, but actually what stands behind that. What are the deep root causes why it's so difficult to, while we know what we need to do, to actually get on with it and do it in a sense. So I don't know who's best placed to answer that, but that's where my question is.
Okay, I mean, maybe Karen first, if you could respond to that. And I wonder if we might get a response from Pablo as well.
I would like
Karen and Lorena.
I would say to go straight to Pablo.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's a really important question, and that's why you could say that, you know, looking at national urban policies can be apparently a bit dry compared to the action on the ground that was happening around us in the other papers. But actually, I think it's a really interesting entry point for quite important things to happen. And so it's a, if you like, it's a brick in the building of this multilateral governance that I think we should pay more attention to, and make sure that when those opportunities arise, that we actually take advantage of them. So civil society engages with them, because it's quite far away from civil society. But actually, they could be potentially very, very important, particularly as they frame the roles and relationships between different layers of government and civil society. They frame the fiscal, you know, the money is where, that's where the money is. And it's if they're framing that fiscal division of resources, of national resources, and the right to tax, the right to spend revenues, these are absolutely fundamental ways in which our changes will happen. And hence, I think, you know, we need to pay attention when those things happen. They don't always happen in an easily recognizable national urban policy. Sometimes they happen within sectoral policies. You know, sometimes they happen in another way, but I think we need to be looking out for that middle level to make use of.
Thanks, Karen. I wonder if I might sort of turn it to Pablo, and particularly the question about why. So, given how important national governments are in framing these things, given the importance they are in holding the purse strings, why are national governments not engaging with, in a lot of cases, with a lot of these issues that would enable the localization that we've said is so important? Pablo?
Thank you, and thank you all for the presentations. They were brilliant. I think it has to do with what Lorena was saying, which is starting from the relevance of language, which is, if you go to the Habitat Resolution, which is all UN, United Nations, the only resolution they have on localization, for them, localization means the voluntary local reviews only. That's it. The operation of reporting the local implementation. So we need to protect the language that localization for us is not this. Why they are not engaging? It's a matter of, it's a shift of power, localization. And this is why they are not engaging. And it's easier for member states to call localization the way we report than engaging with the political process of shifting power, both in territories, but particularly in the multilateral international system, which is where we are trying to bring about the transformation and to bring the shift of power. So in these two things, continuity, as Lorena was saying, a way of guaranteeing this continuity is having civil society stakeholders structurally following the multilateral decisions and the processes being implemented. But second, saying that localization is not only offering a way to report for cities to the UN. So I think it is this. It is about power, and it is they are appropriating of language of what localization can be.
Thank you, Pablo. Lorena, do you want to add anything to that?
No, actually, just one line, which is redistribution of power, basically. It's redistribution of political power, economic power, and symbolic power too, actually. So I think that's the key, and we are seeing that in particular context now, with all the signs are pointing in the wrong direction, and even we see that changes at the national level, so those get reflected at the international level too. So now the multilateral system is being affected for this shift to the right, and basically going backwards in so many of the social policies, social protection mechanisms, and so on, direct attack on human rights and direct attacks on civil society. So we are seeing that, a reflection of that at the multilateral level. At the same time, I mean, they are there, but they're like in working towards the implosion of the system, like so many right-wing political parties are doing at the national level. They are doing that at the international level too. So they are working against the UN system, against the multilateral system. And that, becomes tricky because we, from the civil society point of view, we know all the shortcomings of the multilateral system as it is. But then if we criticize that is functional to those who actually want to dismantle the whole thing. So we are in a very tricky position, and that's why it's so important working together with local and regional governments, which are elected officials, and trying to bring that transformation from the local level. But I think it's probably now more important than ever that we bring those voices to the multilateral system, because there are attacks from the outside, there are attacks from the inside, and there are also a lot, of course, inertia and bureaucratic things that don't work in favor of the system either. So it's a very critical moment in that sense too.
If I might abuse my power as chair, I also think we have to recognise that a lot of what you described as the right-wing shift is enabled by the fact that national and local politicians, some, not all, have found a receptive constituency that supports this, probably from a fear of change, probably from a fear of the challenges we face, but it's then enabling this to continue. So it's not true that the grassroots is always going to be our allies in the things we're talking about. We have to recognize that some communities are very much not on board with this. And that, again, adds a dimension to this idea of localization, that some localizations will work in a way that is constructive in the direction we're talking, but some will not. And that also complicates the picture on a very multi-scalar level way. Adriana?
No, perhaps adding to that, I think that there are, in response to the why, two additional things that perhaps need to be flagged. One is the taming effect, which I think impacts the state, but also citizens, and perhaps might explain some of that political behavior and so on, of decades of neoliberalism. So we are not out of that. We are still very much immersed in very normalized and internalized ways of thinking that the only way around the city is to have property rights, is to have a title, is just to vote. That's my only engagement. So all those things, all that taming is very, very much alive. The second thing that I think that is important to acknowledge is that through that taming and through decades of taming, we also have seen an increase in terms of the corporate capture, both of national governments and of the multilateral system. The United Nations system is not what it was. It's completely captured. Yeah? The spaces, there were more spaces for local governments and for civil society in the past that are shrinking completely. And the same is true for the state. Of course, in addition to that, you will have as well a very even longer trend, that is the fact that national governments have been for even longer unable to see the urban turn. No? The rural bias in the way in which national governments think that development has to be pursued, implemented, redistribution has to happen and so on, doesn't still feature cities and human settlements very strongly. So we have three, I think, challenges in that way of thinking, framing and so on, of perhaps a different duration, that are quite continuous. And as you said, I think I really like the visualization, not the trend, but the visualization of the implosion from the state. It made me think about, we're both from Argentina, and our current president, which is an expression of all that he says, he puts it very clearly. He says, who is better positioned to reform the state but someone who hates the state? Yeah? And this is extraordinary. He's saying that because he's combining neoconservatism with a neoliberal recipe extraordinarily well. Yeah? So it's a very, very problematic. Yeah.
Thank you.
But probably not the words to change to finish.
Well, I think we're going to let Karen finish. We will need to finish, unfortunately.
I would like to finish on a more
optimistic note. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that what we've also seen in the last decades is not just all the closing down and and reorganizing of these issues that you're talking about. But we've also seen the creation of new kinds of network relationships. Relationships like, for example, this emergence of, for example, city assembly, but basically cities in different parts of the world grouping together to lobby for something different, working with networks of civil society to lobby for something different. In other words, the national structure doesn't need to define the space for action anymore. We have the technologies and we have the mindsets and the different ways of operating now. That means that we cross those boundaries. So we are able, through grassroots movements that like Sunbuilders International, like the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights, which straddle countries and regions, which can lobby with governments and with cities. I think cities have become potentially interesting political actors in this. And a kind of a new tradition of city diplomacy emerging in different ways. So I think that there are, just as there are, and we can be overwhelmed by the negative kind of forces that appear to be closing down spaces for action. At the same time, I think there are new coalitions, new ways of working together that do open up new spaces. And we just have to hang on to that.
I think that's the best possible. Thank you everyone here, and thank you everyone online for your comments, for your attention. It's an important discussion, and obviously it's got to continue. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the next phases are. Thank you to Pablo for speaking as well.